Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today. This session will focus on highlighting what is being done practically in health and care to support the evaluation and evidence-based deployment of AI solutions that can improve people's health and well-being and support the NHS workforce. I'm Brhmie Balaram, Head of AI Research and Ethics in the NHS AI Lab, and I'll be chairing today's panel. With me today, I have Jennifer Hall, a Senior Data Scientist within the NHS AI Lab. We also have Emma Hughes, a Senior Manager in the Accelerated Access Collaborative, who is part of a team that is overseeing evaluations of AI technologies for the AI Award. And finally, we have Harriet Unsworth, a Technical Advisor with NICE, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. Harriet's been overseeing the updated evidence standards framework for AI. So these panelists have all been involved in various ways in validating and evaluating AI technologies in health and care, and today we're going to hear more about these efforts that they've been involved in. So we're going to start off by speaking to Jennifer from the AI Lab, who has also been involved with setting up the data infrastructure for training and testing screening technologies during the pandemic. So Jen, can you please tell us a little bit about the National COVID-19 Chest Imaging Database?
Absolutely, yeah. So the National COVID-19 Chest Imaging Database is a centralized database of pseudonymized data. So in the database, we have X-rays, CT scans, and MRI scans, as well as metadata to go with those images. So we have information about the patient demographic data. We also have key dates, such as when the images were taken. We also have some background medical history of the patient, and we also know whether or not the patient was COVID positive at that time that the scan was taken. The database was founded in 2020 at the start of the pandemic with the Royal Surrey NHS Foundation Trust, the British Society of Thoracic Imaging, and a company called Faculty. And the real purpose was to help fight the COVID-19 virus at that time, and to support researchers in a place where they had all this data to be able to explore what AI can do. 2 years on, there are 27 trusts now contributing to NCCID. We have over 80,000 images in the database, which is about 28,000 patients. So it's a really sizable database now, which is incredibly exciting. In terms of who can access the database, it is open to researchers and people who want to develop AI models, but there are very strict permissions on how that data can be used. People can request to access database, but any requests go through a committee and can be reviewed before any access is given. In terms of how it's set up for testing and training, it's important that the database is as representative of the UK population as possible. And that is especially important in terms of validation as well, to make sure the models perform fairly across the population. The NCCID is separated into training and test data sets, and patients are split 50-50 between these training and test data sets. And the reason for this is that researchers or people developing AI models only have access to the training data, so we keep that validation data set totally separate, and no one ever sees that data, and the reason for that is to make sure the models are performing as expected.
That's great. So with NCCID, you were also able to carry out a validation exercise. So can you tell us more about the importance of that and what you learned from the process?
Yeah, so NCCID is a large database, like I mentioned, so it was perfect for trying to separate the training and the validation exercise. And at the start of the pandemic, there were a lot of technologies that were coming out to see whether or not we can identify COVID-19 in chest scan images. And one of the ways in which we thought we can validate some of that research was through this validation exercise to make sure that the technologies were performing as expected. So in 2021, the AI Lab, with a number of other partners as well, looked to do a feasibility study to see how we can independently validate these different technologies that were coming out. So the validation exercise looked to test models in predicting whether COVID-19 was in these scans and whether some of the symptoms of COVID-19 could be predicted from X-ray scans. So 5 vendors took part in this process. So they had developed models that were separate from NCCID, and then we were going to test them for the validation. So there was mainly 5 steps to the validation process. So we created the validation step from NCCID. The models were then deployed onto the cloud infrastructure securely, and the models were then run on the validation set. And then the models were assessed, looking at the performance compared to metrics that were agreed with the vendor, as well as making sure the model performed across different parts and different groups of the population, as well as making sure that the model was robust in terms of how it dealt with scans from different machines and different imaging equipment. In terms of what we learned from that, it was the first time that something had been done like that in the team. So it was incredibly exciting, and also taught us a lot in terms of how we can scale that process up in the future, as well as providing a valuable blueprint to how these kind of independent valuations can be done.
That's really helpful. So are you publishing the report on validation, or how will you share some of the findings from this process?
So in terms of some of the learnings, we do have something already published on the website, on the AI Lab NHS website, around sort of a high-level case study about the work that was completed, as well as, I believe, the report will be coming out soon.
Okay, that's really great. So I know that you also worked in the Skunkworks team, which took a different approach to testing what works in AI. So can you tell us about some of the prototypes that you developed and what you learned from this approach to innovation and deployment?
Yeah, so the Skunkworks team is a small team within the AI Lab, which focuses on very small experimental projects. And they're very focused projects that we work very closely with NHS organisations on. So we work with a number of trusts who actually suggest the ideas to us on how AI can support. So there's a range of projects which we focus on. So we focused on forecasting bed capacity, to CT scan alignment, to working with hospitals to look at whether we can predict patients who could potentially long stay in hospital. That's over 21 days. And it's really interesting to speak to people who are experts in all these different areas that we can look where AI can be implemented. One of the recent projects we worked on was with Gloucestershire hospitals, looking at predicting patients who can long stay. And it was looking at whether we, at admission, can we give frontline clinicians a prediction as to whether or not this person is likely to stay a long time in hospital. And the reason why that would be helpful is then they can help to then tailor the care accordingly. So we worked really closely with clinicians, technologists, a range of different expertise and fields. And I think that's kind of the most important thing that we've learned from doing these projects, is that constant engagement with a range of different skill sets and different inputs. And most of our Skunkworks projects was 3 months. So in 3 months, we had a working prototype on how we can do some of these predictions, which was incredibly exciting. And we're looking forward to seeing the next stages of that. But the Skunkworks project works in a very different way in terms of actually looking at problem-specific areas and how AI can help support the health and social care sector.
That's really great to hear about. Thank you so much for that overview. Emma, I'm going to turn to you to talk about the evaluation process for the AI award. So can you actually start us off by sharing a bit of background about the AI award, and then talk us through the evaluation process for mature technologies in particular?
Yeah, sure. So the AI award is split across 4 phases, and that's based on the maturity of the AI technologies. So the first 2 phases, phase 1 and 2, are sort of more aimed at pre-regulatory development of the AI and clinical validation of it. So phase 2 is probably a little bit more akin to what Jennifer was talking about in terms of the validation of the AI against a data set. Then phase 3 is for first sort of prospective real-world testing of AI technologies that already have or are very close to regulatory approval. And then phase 4 is for the wider scale adoption of AI technologies that have some real-world evidence and just need to have that push to be able to be adopted and generate further real-world evidence that would inform national adoption. As part of the award, which is an over £100 million fund, we've also set aside £8 million pounds to fund the independent evaluation of the phase 4 technologies as they are deployed across multiple sites across the NHS. And those evaluations are informed by a MedTech early assessment, which is actually conducted by colleagues at NICE. and that's really a gap analysis that says these are the main evidence gaps that you would need to fill in order to inform national scale adoption. So that's what we do in terms of that late stage real world evaluation of AI.
Okay. Can you tell us about what the status of the evaluations currently is? And is there anything that you can share with us about your evaluation findings to date?
Yeah, so the evaluations that we fund are multi-year evaluations. So they're actually, I should have said we've funded 2 rounds of the award so far, and then followed up that kind of award funding with the independent evaluation funding. So the phase 4 evaluations aren't expected to read out until 2024 in terms of the final results. But we're expecting to see interim results in around September time this year. But we have also seen some early qualitative results that speak to the barriers and enablers of adoption of these AI technologies. And we've learned quite a bit about some of the challenges that our innovators face in terms of the multiple levels of approval they have to go through in order to actually deploy their technologies in the first place. So I would say that's what we've learned about so far, and we will have to look out for the quantitative sort of clinical efficacy and value results that will be coming out later on this year, those early interim findings anyway.
So to clarify, the qualitative findings focused on barriers to adoption.
Yeah, so the qualitative findings have really looked at they're really process evaluations, so they evaluate the process of the implementation of the AI technologies and comment on what are the barriers and the enablers of that process. And then the quantitative findings will tell you the more summative findings, so what is the impact of these technologies on patient outcomes, on staff time, and also what is the cost effectiveness of these technologies. So are those outcomes worth the money that we're being asked to pay for them?
So can you give us some examples of some of the barriers that were identified?
Yes, well, some of the challenges are around the different levels of, I guess, comfort from trusts in terms of, that is NHS hospital trusts, in terms of data sharing or data processing by commercial AI companies. Just to give you an example, I think some of the projects found that they were able to get up and running quite quickly. So within a month or so, they were able to, a month or so after engaging with the trust, they were able to have their data processing agreement signed and the AI technology get up and running. Whereas others have found that it's taken close to a year for that whole process to run through. So I think there is quite a lot of variability in terms of the confidence and comfort with that. And then one of the other barriers is just that, as we all know, hospitals are quite stretched at the moment. So although these technologies have the potential to support with some of those capacity issues, at the time when you're testing the AI technologies, you're basically going to have to be double running the technology alongside your standard of care, so that takes extra effort, and a lot of the trusts struggle with the capacity to actually do those, support those projects. So that's another barrier that people have seen. But on the plus side, one of the enablers that our projects have seen is around peer learning and supporting networks of trusts to understand the hurdles that they have come up against in terms of the deployment of AI, and really just supporting clinicians and teams within the trust to speak to each other to overcome some of those issues.
Oh, that's really great. So just to clarify also with this data, so is 2024 when all of the evaluations will be published, or just from the first round?
We're aiming for most of them to be published in 2024, okay. Actually, because we've managed to accelerate the commissioning process from round one. So yeah. Okay.
And I just have one last question for you, Emma, which is, how is this informing future evaluation practices and how we build an evidence base for deploying AI?
That's a great question. So although we'll have to wait until 2024 for those definitive results, we are learning a lot as we go in terms of the how-to for real-world evaluation of AI, and there aren't currently any specific standards around that, although Harriet is going to talk a little bit more about standards in a minute. But we've learned quite a lot about the practical challenges for our evaluators in terms of designing these evaluations and then implementing them. And just to sort of give some examples of those challenges, quite often AI technologies have fairly broad potential use cases. So their regulatory approval is for quite a broad set of use cases, if you like. But when it comes to evidence generation, it's quite important to hone in on what specific value proposition you want to evidence, because it takes a lot of time and money to evidence these things. And one of the things that our evaluators have found challenging is trying to get the technology companies to be specific about the claims that they want to evidence, what their sort of priorities are, because they can tend to be quite broad and far-reaching. So and just to illustrate that, one of our awardees is looking at the detection of cancer from CT scans, and there was a question as to whether the technology should be evaluated in a screening setting only, or in the routing setting, or both. And so that was something that our evaluator had to work through with the technology company to try and hone in on. So yeah, that's just one of the examples of the challenges that they face.
So just a follow-up question to that, is the value proposition not clear in the regulatory documents? Because all of the technologies that are being evaluated are CE marked.
Yeah, they are CE marked. The main issue is that those CE marks can be quite broad, and multiple different. The AI technologies can be used in multiple different settings, or kind of multiple different stages along a patient's pathway.
Okay. And for the selection process for the award, the value proposition probably was similarly broad, or like matched what was in the...
Yeah, exactly, because the selection was based on the potential of these technologies to derive outcomes. But when it came down to the nitty-gritty of actually implementing these evaluations, there was a necessity to be a little bit more pragmatic, I guess, and focus in on the main priority areas.
Okay, for them to be much more specific.
Yeah.
Okay, that's really helpful. So Harriet, I'm going to turn to you now. I was wondering if you could start by telling us what the evidence standards framework for digital health technologies is and why it's relevant to AI companies.
Yeah, sure. So the Evidence Standards Framework, I'll call it the ESF, just to explain my acronyms as we go along, is a piece of work we first created in 2019. And it was commissioned by NHS England at the time, just to help us answer that question that we at NICE get asked all the time from digital companies, which is, what evidence do I need? What evidence do I need to show for my product to be used in the NHS? So with the Evidence Standards Framework, we've created a non-mandated set of standards that can be used by evaluators within the health and care system so that they can spot what kind of evidence is available for a product. So we know for digital, most commissioning is at a local level. So the ESF isn't something for NICE to use. This isn't part of NICE guidance. It's not a tool that the NICE guidance teams are using. But it's something that we can set out to the system so that commissioners or innovation leads or people who are interested in a new digital or AI technology, so that they can use it and have a structured framework to look at the evidence available for a digital healthcare tool. So we first created the ESF back in 2019, and last year NHSX came back and asked us to update it with a few aims, so to streamline it and to make it better aligned to regulatory requirements, but also to add standards that cover artificial intelligence, particularly AI, that may change over time, because that had been excluded from the first version of the ESF while we were waiting for various other bits in the system to fall into place. So that's the work we've been doing since over the last year.
Okay, that's really helpful. And so this was decided by NHS Transformation Directorate and NICE together. And was this something that AI companies had also been giving you feedback on, in terms of, I'm just trying to understand the decision-making process for why it needed to be updated specifically for AI?
Yeah, so I think because there's this kind of, I'm preaching to the choir here, you all know this, there are different issues around AI. In terms of NICE evaluations, we're very good at looking at something at a point in time. So evaluating a drug that will be the same today as it will be tomorrow or next year, it's not going to change. Whereas we know with AI tools and many other digital health interventions as well, they may change over time. That effectiveness may change, the intended use may change, and that impacts on the system impact as well. So we've got this aspect of change to consider, but also looking at some of those data considerations, like how can you make a good AI healthcare tool that will serve the whole population well and is designed well without bias and without risks within that data. So there were these additional aspects we needed to include within the ESF. So we didn't do this work alone. We had an academic consortium working with us from Imperial College, the University of Birmingham, and the Alan Turing Institute, who ran a really extensive piece of work which culminated in a kind of Delphi consensus process to work out exactly what those elements were we needed to include in the standards to make sure that we're kind of asking those key questions around AI in health.
Thank you. And what sort of changes are you proposing to make to the framework to reflect the adoption of AI in health and care?
So, yeah, we've made quite a few changes. I think we've kept the core principles the same, that we're providing a clear set of standards so that companies can see what they need to what kind of evidence they need to produce, and evaluators can understand what they're looking for. But we've changed the layout, so we've made it a bit more simple. I don't know whether anybody had looked at the ESF before, but it was kind of, there were different levels of evidence and some kind of modifier questions. But we've made a single kind of standard set now. So there are 21 standards. And we've included those specific standards that cover AI. So that's one of the changes. So we've got the data aspects, the measuring change or measuring changes in performance over time. But also we've kind of stepped outside of NICE's usual remit a bit and looked at some of the deployment factors. So perhaps learning from some of your experiences in the AI award and from other people we've spoken to along the way, about how can we ensure that those benefits of AI health tools are realised in practice. So what does a hospital, a trust need to consider when they're looking at purchasing a new AI system, and how can they make that process of rolling that out quite smooth and easy for everybody involved?
Okay, thank you, Harriet. So I have some questions for all of you. The first one that I have here is, how can we be more strategic in how we share our knowledge about assessing AI to help others who are also trying to build an evidence base for deploying these technologies? So yeah, that's an open question to anyone who wants to.
Yeah.
take that first.
Shall I jump in?
Yeah, sure.
I think to say we already do work pretty well across different parts of the health and care system. We've been updating the ESF, we've been reaching out to many different stakeholders, including the AI Award, including companies and the regulators, and trying to involve different voices in the project as we go along. But yeah, I think it really is key for us to keep in contact and make sure that we don't lose this learning along the way.
Yeah. And just to add to that, kind of to evidence how we are practically working together, once the evidence standards framework is published, we plan to follow that up with that kind of more theoretical framework with our practical learnings about those challenges and approaches that our evaluators have used to basically try and meet those standards. So we're hoping that NICE kind of shares the theoretical, what good looks like, and then we can provide the practical learnings about how to actually achieve that. So yeah, like Harriet says, I think it's all about working together in a coordinated way.
Mm. And I think I'll just say in terms of the validation exercise, just being really clear in terms of what the purpose is. So in the validation exercise we did in the imaging team, is working very closely with vendors and being very clear in terms of what the purpose was and what the aim was to get out of it. So I think in terms from a strategic point of view, just being very clear and making sure that, again, that we've got involvement from all different parties.
It's really great. So I have one last question before I open it up to the audience. So my question is around, should we be involving patients and the public in the process of assessing AI? And if so, how can we do this? So, I like to jump in first. I'll go in. So we held a patient expert panel session when we were developing our AI standards for the evidence standards framework, and it was a really interesting process because as always, it was very informative and surprising. It didn't go the direction I thought, but it was extremely enlightening to hear those patients' views. And I think one of their key driver was, I do not want a computer deciding my care. So their key concern from all of them was that there should be human clinical insight or human clinical involvement in their care pathway. So I think that was really important to hear. Yeah. Was the consultation open to the public as well for the evidence standards framework?
Yeah, we had a public consultation that ran in April, so that's closed now. And we're just going through some final internal sign-off following the changes that we made from the consultation and expecting to publish at the beginning of July.
And just to say, absolutely, patients and the public should be involved in AI research and, quite frankly, any healthcare research. And we have an expectation for the independent evaluations that we are commissioning that patient and public involvement is involved in terms of the design and also implementation of those evaluations. And then as part of the selection process for the award, on the whole, patient and public involvement plans was a key part of that selection process, and we had PPI representatives on all of our panels as well. It's a really important part because that question of acceptability of AI technologies to not only the clinicians who use them, but also to the end users, those patients, is so important.
Yeah. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of our skunkworks projects, and again with the validation work, we make sure that case studies are published in terms of the work that we're doing. So we're really open about the approach that we've took, why we did it, and what we've learned from it. And I think that's also important in terms of having that engagement from the public, and so it's very clear in terms of, and transparent in terms of the work that we do.
That's great. So now I'm going to open up for questions from the audience. Is there anyone that has a question?
Thanks for an interesting discussion. I just want to remember this old saying from the software engineering industry that when you're designing a system, it's not enough to do the thing right, you also need to do the right thing. So are there any standards for basically deciding that what you're trying to implement is actually the correct thing and not something that will lead you into the woods and to implement the wrong solution? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. So I think, as Emma mentioned about this key part for any healthcare technology about setting your value proposition is that thing, isn't it? Find a problem and address that problem, and then be able to explain clearly to evaluators what exactly you're solving and how you're solving it. So what are the benefits to patients and what are the benefits to the health and care system? So we do have standards around that. So this is, really nice is kind of core ground looking at that economic impact of different health technologies. So we have some standards around kind of presenting what that value proposition would be, and then how to evidence those and what kind of evidence, some basic economic analysis to show the system impact, as well as what kind of clinical evidence should be shown to show that really is happening in practice, that there is patient benefit in practice.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd just like to add that I think your point is a really important one. So I'm part of the Accelerated Access Collaborative, and one of the key things that we look at is around demand signaling. So identifying what are actually the key needs of the NHS and communicating that to innovators. And I think we do really need to get better at supporting trust and integrated care systems, which are currently being developed, to think strategically about where AI can really help their populations, because there are many innovators and many AI technologies that are being developed, and I think we need to, as a sort of national organisation, support trusts and systems to be more proactive about saying what their needs are and inviting people to come in and respond to those.
I think from, just to add to that as well, when we was part of the Skunkworks team, the key thing that we always did was speak to the people who are actually going to be using this tool. And I think that's always the key, is to actually really understanding, when we're talking about what the model is going to be predicting, for example, making sure that prediction is actually helpful and is feeding in to the work stream correctly. So I think make sure that everyone is involved who's going to be using the tool, experts in the field. In our case, in the project that we worked on, and clinicians as well, are all involved in that early stages to help guide that before it gets too far down the development path.
Something else that I wanted to add was that in the ethics team, we worked with the Ada Lovelace Institute to develop an algorithmic impact assessment. And that's essentially a model or a tool that you can use as part of deciding whether to take forward a proposed AI solution. So for example, this was in reference to NCCID, which we talked about earlier. So at the point of data access, this is a process that involves the public in exploring some of the legal, social, and ethical implications of the proposed product. And the developers are involved, or the researchers are involved in that process as well, and they're able to take on that feedback and make adjustments at the early stage of development, so that whatever that they do develop going forward based on patient data is something that everybody feels suitably comfortable with and that they think is going to have wider patient and public benefit as well. Do we have any other questions?
Hi. Can you hear? What are the major AI models currently deployed by the NHS with regards to patients, and what are they trying to predict?
I can give you some examples of our sort of most mature technologies. So, and then maybe Jennifer would like to come in. But the most mature technologies tend to be focused on image interpretation. Just to give you a couple of examples of our phase 4 ones, they're looking at interpreting mammograms that are taken as part of the breast screening program to support radiologists to decide whether or not to recall a woman for further tests for breast cancer. Some of the other use cases are AI technologies to analyze suspicious moles and support GPs with making that decision of whether or not to refer for urgent assessment by a dermatologist. So those, I would say, imaging is definitely the most mature kind of use case. But we also have AI technologies that do a bunch of other stuff. So around triaging patients at the point of primary care consultation, so assessing patients as to whether they should be seen by a GP or by a pharmacist or by a nurse. So AI technologies to support the workforce to do that. And then we also have AI chatbots that supports people to manage their own mental health as well. So yeah, a really big range, but imaging is definitely the most mature use case, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, as Emma said, there's a huge range of possible applications of AI, and the teams that I've worked in, we're fairly early on in that journey. So when we do these proof of concepts of feasibility, we're not close to actually deploying some of those models. So I think Emma's examples about some of the later, more mature award winners was really good.
Excuse me. Thank you for the talk. Well, my question is about, you mentioned the transparency or keeping health professionals in the loop when it comes to these AI technologies, the AI tools. Can you speak a little bit more about what that looks like and what kind of how you're solving the problem with when these systems are famously sort of black box and not very transparent?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky one. I don't think we'd be able to solve it within just the one piece of work. I think, so within the evidence standards framework, we've taken the approach that we just need some clarity. So where the company should be able to clearly define what the role of the kind of human clinical element is in that decision-making process. So we've not set any standards. We've not set a minimum level of human involvement because I don't think that would be appropriate for every situation. And we're not looking to create any barriers to innovation. You know, we're really looking to enable the good innovation to come through and not stop anything kind of on the basis of one aspect. So yeah, we just need clarity about exactly where the human element is in that system.
Thank you. I'm just going to stand because I couldn't see you. I just had a question with regards to how the process of developing and deploying new AI systems might change as the integrated care system comes into play, and how that process might change. Because from everything I've read, I don't all the way understand how that might alter the process of working with HSNs or going through the process of NICE, being a cost-saving device, say, through NICE, and any guidance on that would be really amazing.
I can take a first pass on that. So I think there's maybe two things. With the establishment of integrated care systems and the general push to develop trusted research environments and support the development and interoperability of data, that will really help to accelerate the development and testing of AI technologies as innovators get easier access to health records and health data. So that's kind of one thing that's, I guess, loosely related to integrated care systems. And then the other thing is, as I mentioned earlier, I think integrated care systems will allow systems to take a strategic system level view of what their highest needs are and where AI can help them best, and that will in turn accelerate the adoption of AI, because you won't just have individual trusts making adoption decisions, you'll have decisions across an entire integrated care system, which will hopefully, it will mean innovators not having to have 500 conversations, they'll just have to have maybe 10. So yeah.
Okay, that's really helpful, just because I'm within the NHS and UCL and as a company as well. So our organisation is across kind of like multiple sort of like Imperial and UCL then different like studies, and then so just how access to patient health data, because at the moment we have that through the hospital, but that you're saying through the integrated care systems, then is it that as in you have to be kind of like one of the innovators within an NHSN to then have access to that data? Is that the process?
No, you wouldn't have to be an innovator within an AHSN. So there's a broader, and I don't know if Jennifer wants to talk to this at all, but there's a broader move to make data more accessible to everybody, innovators and general researchers, which is separate really from the development of integrated care systems. I would say integrated care systems are more about taking a strategic approach to commissioning at a system level, which should accelerate that adoption end of the spectrum.
Okay, that makes sense. Do you have any information about where, like, just because sort of where those kind of open calls, or how to kind of be more in connection with, say, a given ICS, and where to sort of liaise, I guess, because I'm pretty inside of everything and I'm still quite unsure. There are bulletins about integrated care systems and the kind of latest, but yeah, it is a bit of a moving target. But yeah, there are bulletins that you can sign up to be kind of up to date with what's going on.
Thanks. So I think we have time for one more question.
Hi. I just want to kind of preface this by saying that I am not an AI specialist. I am a student who is very keen on it. So apologies if this is a kind of a dumb question. When one typically looks at AI training model data and the biases that occur within it, it is usually like a stagnant data set. In my experience, how do you deal with, well, it's kind of a two-parter, like what biases even are you looking for in medical data predominantly? Because to me is a bit of a, it doesn't seem like something where initially there's like very standout biases, and then also, how do you then deal with models that are like evolving if new research data comes through to propose that what the AI is looking for is actually it was heading in the wrong direction all the time? Like, what do you then do with those large data sets that were probably, not providing you with the correct evidence? I appreciate that that's probably not a very good question.
No, it's a great question. It's not dumb at all. Jen, why don't we go to you on that one?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of understanding model biases, it's incredibly important, especially in healthcare, and that's to make sure the model is performing well for groups across the population. So that can be ethnicity, sex, different age groups, and it's important to understand the models and in terms of their performance against these different groups, so we know what the impact are if we did deploy a model, for example. What the impact of that would be, and I think that's covered in some of the algorithmic impact assessment as well. And then to your second point, in terms of the change in data set, it's a really interesting topic around how you actually monitor models in deployment, and it's something that needs to be done continuously, especially, it can depend on the application, but especially in healthcare, we have to be incredibly sensitive and aware, because you can have things like model decay over time, so the performance can decay. So we need to be especially careful when that happens, and especially as well as monitoring performance against different subgroups of the population as well. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but yes, so just to summarise, yes, we make sure that healthcare, that the model performs well across the whole population, and we also make sure about the that as the data changes, that the model doesn't decay in performance.
Yeah. Thanks for that Jen, and thank you to all of our panelists today for joining us and for the audience as well. That brings a close to the session.